Hi everyone, so this week we will be talking about moral development. We will be talking about theories of moral development, pro-social behavior, and antisocial behavior. When we talk about morality, we are talking about what is right or wrong, and sometimes things are not so black and white. For example, maybe a girl steals food to feed her starving sister. Or maybe a teen boy helps to fix his friend's bike because he wants to borrow it later. And developmental psychology's role is not to determine what is moral, but to see how children think when solving moral conflicts and how their reasoning changes with age. The two main researchers we will be talking about with moral development are Piaget and Kohlberg. Starting with Piaget, he believed that moral judgment changes over time. It starts with a rigid acceptance of rules and authority, where whatever the rules say goes and there is no gray area. But as children grow, they understand that moral rules are a product of social interaction and are modifiable. They are something that everyone has agreed on and are a construct as opposed to a tangible thing. And this understanding develops through peer interactions, where children are exposed to different ideas and moral situations. And Piaget studied this development first through observing children playing games with peers that involve issues of fairness. But he also did this through interviewing children. Piaget's interviews consisted of telling children different stories and having them talk about them. These are two examples of stories told in interviews. The first story says, a little boy who is called John is in his room. He is called to dinner. He goes into the dining room. But behind the door there was a chair, and on the chair there was a tray with 15 cups on it. John couldn't have known that there was all this behind the door. He goes in, the door knocks against the tray, bang go the 15 cups, and they all get broken. And the second story says, once there was a little boy whose name was Henry. One day when his mother was out, he tried to get some jam out of the cupboard. He climbed up onto the chair and stretched out his arm. But the jam was too high up and he couldn't reach it and have any. But while he was trying to get it, he knocked over a cup. The cup fell down and broke. And this implies that the child did this while doing something he wasn't supposed to do. And after reading these, children would be asked which boy was naughtier and why. Piaget would examine their thinking about what constitutes the transgression of a rule, the role of intentions in morality, whether certain punishments are just, and how resources should be divided depending on the stories told. From the children's answers, Piaget believed that there are two moral stages with a transitional period between them. The first stage being heteronomous morality, where children regard rules and duties to others as unchangeable givens. In other words, morality is black and white, and justice is whatever authorities say is right. And if you think back to Piaget's stages, children would still be in the pre-operational stage, because it's not until the concrete operational stage that they can start to reason logically and think abstractly. To children in this stage, the thing that makes an action good or bad is the consequence of the behavior, not the intention. So based on the interview, children would say that breaking 15 glasses on accident is worse than breaking one while doing something that you're not supposed to do. Part of this might come from parents' control over their children, but it might also come from not being cognitively mature yet. After the heteronomous stage, children enter a transitional period where peer interactions teach them to take another's perspective and develop beliefs about fairness. After this transitional phase, they enter the autonomous stage of morality, around 11 to 12, where they no longer accept blind obedience to authority as the basis of moral behavior. So just because someone is in authority says to do something doesn't make it right. There is now an understanding that rules are a product of social agreement and can be changed if the majority agrees to it. And when considering if something is moral, there is now a consideration of fairness and equality, as well as the idea that a punishment should fit the crime, and that adults are not always fair in how they deliver punishment. There is also consideration of motives and intention. So these children would say that breaking one cup while pilfering jam is worse than breaking 15 on accident. So, in support of this theory, we see that children do increasingly take motives into account with age. And parenting punitiveness is associated with a less mature moral reasoning, showing the influence of parents' authority. We also see support for the idea of cognitive immaturity, where cognitive tasks, such as with IQ or perspective taking, are positively associated with scores on moral development tasks. However, there are critiques as well. The overall body of research does not support this theory of moral development, and Piaget seems to be underestimating children's ability to consider intentionality, as we do see that young children believe that some things, such as hitting, are wrong, even if an adult says that it's okay. A man named Lawrence Kohlberg took Piaget's ideas and expanded on them. His main goal was to examine the sequences through which children develop moral reasoning over time. And he proposed a sequence of reasoning that was both discontinuous and hierarchical, where there are stages that go from basic to more advanced reasoning. And like Piaget, he had interview stories that he would have children talk about, the most famous being the Heinz dilemma. The story states that in Europe, a woman was near death from a special kind of cancer. There was one drug that the doctors thought might save her. It was a form of radium that a druggist in the same town had recently discovered. The drug was expensive to make, but the druggist was charging 10 times what it cost him to make. He paid $200 for the radium and charged $2,000 for a small dose of the drug. The sick woman's husband, Heinz, went to everyone he knew to borrow the money, but he could only get together $1,000, which is half of what it cost. He told the druggist that his wife was dying and asked him to sell it cheaper or let him pay later. But the druggist said, "No, I discovered the drug and I'm going to make money from it." So Heinz gets desperate and considers breaking into the man's store to steal the drug for his wife. After telling the story, Kohlberg would ask questions like, should Heinz steal the drug? Would it be right or wrong if he did? And Kohlberg was not interested in the yes or no answer, but rather the reasoning behind the answers. Kohlberg then divided answers into 3 levels of reasoning with different stages. The first level is a pre-conventional level, where children are self-centered and focused on getting rewards and avoiding punishment. The first stage under level 1 is the punishment and obedience orientation, where what is right is dictated by authorities and moral actions are motivated by avoidance of punishment. There is no consideration for the interests of others or even recognition that others' interests differ from their own. The second stage is the instrumental exchange orientation, where what is right is in the child's best interest or involves equal exchange. So, like you hurt me, I hurt you. This stage is very consequence focused. The second level is the conventional level and is centered on social relationships and focuses on compliance with social duties and laws. So under level 2 is stage 3, which is the mutual interpersonal expectations, relationships, and interpersonal conformity orientation, which you can kind of think of as reputation. In this stage, good behavior is doing what is expected by people close to them, or what is generally expected in a given role, such as being a good son or a good boy or girl. Roles are fulfilled based on others around them. Stage 4 is the social system and conscious orientation, which is focused on fulfilling one's duties, upholding laws, and contributing to society or one's group. In other words, they follow the rules and enforce them for others as well. And they do this essentially to keep society from breaking down. The third level is the post-conventional or principled level, which is centered on ideals and focuses on moral principles. Under this level is stage 5, which is the social contract or individual rights orientation, where moral behavior involves upholding rules that are in the best interest of the group, impartial, or mutually agreed on by the group. So it's not just about rules and society, but the people in it and how they are being treated. And then there is stage 6, which is universal ethical principles. In this stage, there is commitment to self-chosen ethical principles that reflect universal principles, such as life, liberty, or basic human rights, that should be upheld in any society. And when a law violates those rights, individuals should act in accordance with these principles, not the law. However, Kohlberg believed that few people make it to this stage. This stage would consist of people like Mother Teresa or Gandhi, and since it is so hard to make it into the stage, it's sometimes just considered an extension of stage 5. So let's walk through an example using these stages. Say a man is driving his pregnant wife who is in labor to the hospital. The woman has been deemed a high-risk pregnancy and must get to the hospital as soon as possible to prevent complications. The question is, should the husband run red lights and speed through residential areas to get his wife to the hospital? Someone in level 1, stage 1, would say, no, it's against the law. This stage is all about following rules. Someone in level 1, stage 2, would say, no, he can get arrested and go to jail as punishment. Or maybe they say yes, and he would get a healthy baby as a reward. This stage is about consequences. Someone in level 2, stage 3, would say no, he would be seen as a lawbreaker who puts his family at risk. Or maybe they say yes, he will be seen as a hero. This stage is about reputation. Someone in level 2, stage 4, would say no, society would break down if we all ignore traffic rules. Someone in level 3, stage 5 would say, yes, the mom and baby's right to live is more important than laws, reputation, or order, and we live in a society to protect these things. And someone in level 3, stage 6 would have a very long-winded answer and consider the effects of everyone involved. This person would understand that others in the same situation might not make the same choice. Like Piaget, there are strengths and weaknesses to Kohlberg's theory. Starting with support, we do see that children systematically change their moral reasoning over time, and that few people ever reach stage 5. However, Kohlberg did not differentiate between truly moral issues and issues of social convention. There is also no consideration for cultural differences. Like we talked about before, different cultures and societies value different things, and this would put different cultures into a stage without consideration of those values. Also, children and adults reason at different levels depending on the context. So it might depend on what the problem is and who is involved. You might be more likely to follow the rules in some situations, but not others, and you might make different decisions if it has to do with strangers as opposed to family or even yourself. And lastly, this theory does not account for differences in gender socialization. There is an argument that males tend to focus on justice, while females tend to focus on caring and responsibility for others, which potentially puts females at a higher stage. However, there is not much evidence for this. The next theory we are going to talk about is social domain theory. This is our current model of moral development and believes that moral reasoning occurs through gradual changes and is continuous as opposed to discontinuous. And it's based on the child's social interactions with peers and adults, as well as through socialization from parents. So in other words, it is very environmentally focused. Parents teach moral behavior both explicitly, such as through direct teaching and discipline, as well as implicitly, such as through setting an example. They may not be directly telling the child what is right or wrong, but they are showing it with their actions. And again, there is a bidirectional relationship here, where children's moral judgments affect parents' behaviors as well. Through peers, equal power allows for more agency in behaviors in moral situations. It creates multiple settings to observe and initiate moral behavior. To negotiate the social world, children must understand 3 domains of social problems: The first is the moral domain, where children gain the understanding that the universal concepts of right and wrong, fairness, justice, and individual rights apply across contexts and supersede rules of authority. For example, stealing another's toy is wrong regardless of the situation. The second is the societal domain, which consists of rules and conventions through which societies maintain order to help children negotiate interactions with those in their environments. This is more cultural and consists of general understandings such as not wearing pajamas to school and saying please and thank you. The last domain is the personal domain, which consists of actions in which individual preferences are the main consideration to help autonomy or identity, and there are no right or wrong choices. This domain would consist of things like how you spend your money or the appearance choices you make. Looking at moral development cross-culturally, we see that there are many shared characteristics of moral decision-making around the world. With social domain theory, we see that moral, societal, and personal judgments are consistent across cultures, and children can distinguish among the domains. We also see that judgments of fairness and welfare for others are largely universal. However, there are some differences as well. For example, we see that children in India hold a belief of moral obligation to attend to the needs of parents and to try to address the needs of peers and strangers, while children in the US do not. This might be because we are a very individualistic society, but there seems to be some collectivistic societies that have these views as well. We also see things like SES that intermix with moral development. For example, one study found that low SES children are less likely than middle-class children to differentiate between moral and societal actions, and prior to adolescence view personal judgments as a matter of choice. Some studies interpret this finding as being due to a greater emphasis on submission and authority, and allowing children less autonomy in low SES households. Switching gears a little bit, we are going to talk about the conscience, which is defined as an internal regulatory mechanism that increases the individual's ability to conform to standards of conduct accepted in their culture. It restrains antisocial behavior or destructive impulses and promotes compliance with adults' rules and standards, even when no one is monitoring them. The conscience used to be thought of as being purely nurture, but there is some new evidence that is suggesting at least a partial nature component. One study showed infants a puppet in the shape of a red circle trying to climb a hill. In one condition, children saw a yellow triangle helping the circle up the hill, and in another, they saw a blue square pushing the circle down the hill. After this happens, the red circle is seen approaching either the helper or the hinderer. And they saw that 10-month-olds show surprise when the red circle approaches the hinderer, and at an even younger age, 4.5-month-olds prefer the helper to the hinderer. And we think this might suggest a nature component because children show this response even before they can be actively taught about it. Looking at parents' influence on the conscience, we see that as children get older, they take on their parents' morals and show guilt when they violate those values and do something they know their parents wouldn't like. And we also see that parenting that is low in parental power and high in reasoning helps children to understand parents' morals. Again, that internalization is important. It's also facilitated by a secure, positive parent-child relationship, which inclines children to be open and eager to internalizing parents' values. The book also talks about temperament and the conscience, where children with different temperaments may develop a conscience in different ways. For example, toddlers who are prone to fear unfamiliar people or situations tend to exhibit more guilt than less fearful children, and their conscience is promoted by gentle discipline, which helps them to become less anxious. But at the same time, gentle discipline is unrelated to the conscience in fearless children, possibly because it may not get their attention. Instead, responsive parenting, mutual cooperation, and positive affect fosters conscience development in fearless children. So different things will work for different kids based on how they naturally behave and respond to situations. There are epigenetic factors as well. For example, we see that the serotonin SLC6A4 gene leads to greater reactivity to the rearing environment and interacts with maternal responsiveness, where high maternal responsiveness and this gene leads to higher levels of conscience between 15 and 54 months of age. But low levels of responsiveness and this gene leads to lower levels of conscience. And if you have a different allele of this gene altogether, there's no effect at all. So this really highlights again that idea of goodness of fit from previous chapters between the temperament and the environment. Moving into prosocial behavior. Prosocial behavior is defined as voluntary behavior intended to benefit another, such as helping, sharing with, and comforting others. And prosocial behavior is rooted in both empathy and sympathy. Empathy is an emotional response to another's emotional state or condition, while sympathy is a feeling of concern for another person in response to their emotional state or condition. So empathy is feeling with someone, and sympathy is feeling for someone. To be able to express empathy or sympathy, children need to be able to take another's perspective, and their ability to do this changes over time. At 14 months, children will show distress when others are upset and express verbal and nonverbal concern when an adult is hurt. Around 18 to 25 months, children may help an adult that explicitly and emotionally communicates need. For example, they will share their toys, comfort them, help them to pick up a dropped object, what have you. After the age of 2, children are more likely to try to comfort someone who is upset than become upset themselves. They will share toys and food and grab things for an adult when they are out of reach. And then around 3 to 4, children will provide assistance and reassurance to an adult who breaks a toy or hurts themselves. In other words, they can act on sympathy and start to have an understanding of social norms and how we react to people who are in need of help. Another part of prosocial behavior is cooperation, and cooperation is driven by both sympathy and a sense of fairness. And we see that children as young as 14 months will cooperate with a peer or an adult towards a goal that is mutually beneficial, such as winning a prize. And going off of that, we see that children will divide a prize up evenly if it's not given to them in that way. As children grow, their increasing levels of moral reasoning and perspective taking lead them to engage in more prosocial behavior, including cooperation and other helping behaviors. There are individual differences with prosocial behavior. Part of these differences might come from biological factors. For example, we think that prosocial behavior may have evolved from collaboration with foraging for food and repelling enemies for survival. Genes that might have predisposed us for prosocial behavior would have been selected for, as those not looking for help would have a harder time surviving, and there would be less of those people to pass on their genes. Looking at genes specifically, we do see that identical twins are more similar with empathy and prosocial behavior than fraternal twins, which does suggest a genetic component. However, the heritability of prosocial behavior does seem to increase with age. When trying to identify prosocial genes, there is a relation between prosocial behavior and genes that are associated with oxytocin, which is sometimes referred to as the love hormone and increases our empathy and positive feelings for others. Again, there's also an association with temperament, where genes that predispose a child to have better emotion regulation show greater sympathy and empathy. Individual differences can also be attributed to environmental factors, such as socialization within the family. When looking at modeling and communication of values, we see that children tend to imitate others' sharing behavior, especially when they have a close relationship to that person. And this leads them to have similar prosocial behaviors to their caregivers. Relating to this, there was a study done by Alliner and Alliner in 1998 that looked at this in a really major way. They interviewed people who either helped to rescue Jewish people from the Nazis in Europe or who were bystanders and did not help. And what they found was that the rescuers were 7 times more likely to report that their parents taught them that values related to caring should be applied to everyone, while bystanders reported that their parents emphasized ethical obligations to family, community, church, and country, but not to others. So there is some evidence that pro-social behavior is changed based on socialization. Continuing on with socialization, it is important for children to have opportunities for engaging in pro-social activities. If pro-social behavior is reinforced, children are likely to engage in it later. This can be as simple as having children help with household tasks that are performed on a regular basis and benefit others in the house, such as dishes or sweeping. They can get involved with community service or service learning, where there's an integration of community service with instruction to promote learning. So maybe there is some ocean cleanup with some information about why this is important and who it is impacting. Through doing so, this allows children to take another's perspective, it increases their confidence that they are competent to help others, and it allows them to experience emotional reinforcement. There is also a relation between socialization and discipline and parenting style. For example, we do see that sympathy and pro-social behavior is associated with constructive, supportive, and authoritative parenting. And moreover, discipline that involves reasoning and internalization is particularly effective at promoting pro-social behavior. On the other hand, physical punishment, threats, and authoritarian parenting is associated with a lack of sympathy and pro-social behavior. And if children are punished for not engaging in pro-social behavior, they may engage in it only to avoid punishment. And you can imagine that when they are out of the house and that punishment isn't there anymore, they might not engage in it. And if children receive material rewards, think money or an award of some sort, for engaging in pro-social behavior, they may only do it for the physical reward and therefore not engage in it when a material reward is not offered. So in other words, reinforcement should come from the good they feel from doing it. There are also peer influences in pro-social behavior. Peer interaction teaches moral principles such as fairness, reciprocity, and justice. One study found that adolescents with higher moral reasoning had greater conflict resolution skills. And children tend to be motivated to do nice things for their friends, both because they care about them and because their kindness will be reciprocated. There are also cultural influences on pro-social behavior. For example, we see that children from traditional communities and subcultures, for example, Mexican children or Mexican American children, are more likely to cooperate on laboratory tasks than children from urban westernized groups. We also see that children in Kenya, Mexico, and the Philippines help, share, and offer support to others in their families and communities more than children in the US, India, and Japan. However, we don't really see any differences between collectivistic and individualistic cultures. And some of the associations we see that may be driving this are age, where older children tend to engage in more pro-social behaviors, and family factors such as socialization. There are some school-based interventions to help promote pro-social behavior. One is called Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports, or PBIS, and uses modeling and reinforcement to promote positive behaviors of staff and students. There are 3 levels to this intervention. The first is primary prevention, which is aimed at both staff and students to prevent problems from even occurring. Posters with behavioral expectations might be put up, or children might be told good job when they're found to be engaging in pro-social behavior. The second level is secondary prevention. At this level, at-risk students are identified and are given more attention and monitoring. The idea being the closer attention on them, the more likely you are to see and catch pro-social behavior and then reinforce it. The third level is tertiary intervention, which is an individualized plan and is created for those engaging in inappropriate, aggressive, or antisocial behavior. So an intervention can really be tailored to that student. And we see that PBIS is really effective and enhances a sense of community where children start to engage in fewer behavioral problems. The opposite of prosocial behavior is antisocial behavior, which is defined as disruptive, hostile, or aggressive behavior that violates social norms or rules and that harms or takes advantage of others. So anger and making someone upset would be considered antisocial. While it is sometimes used in this way, it does not refer to someone who is introverted or not wanting to hang out with people. That is not what we're talking about. Part of antisocial behavior includes aggression, which is defined as a subcategory of antisocial behavior that involves acts intended to physically or emotionally harm others. The development of antisocial behavior starts early. With aggression around 12 months, we see children trying to tug objects away. Around 18 months, we start to see physical aggression such as hitting. And around 2 to 3 years, we actually start to see less physical aggression, but more verbal aggression as children start to develop language more. And the book talks about two types of aggression at this point. Instrumental aggression, which is aggression motivated by trying to obtain a concrete goal, such as a toy, and relational aggression, which we talked about before, which is harming others by damaging their peer relationships, such as excluding peers from a group. Chronic antisocial behavior may meet the qualifications of a clinical disorder, the first of which being oppositional defiant disorder, or ODD, which is defined as angry defiant behavior that is age inappropriate and persistent, meaning that it lasts longer than 6 months. To be diagnosed with ODD, children must exhibit multiple symptoms that are clearly impairing social relationships and school performance. Children with ODD lose their temper easily, argue with and defy adults, blame others for their mistakes or misbehavior, and are spiteful and vindictive. And ODD is predicted by high levels of family conflict and stress, parent depression, insecure attachments, and low self-regulation. There is also conduct disorder, or CD, which is severe antisocial and aggressive behaviors that inflict pain on others, such as through bullying or aggression towards animals, or that involve destruction of property or violation of rights of others, such as through stealing. For children to have CD, they must exhibit multiple symptoms that are clearly impairing social relationships and school performance. They tend to frequently run away from home, stay out all night before the age of 13, and be truant before the age of 13. Children with CD also tend to develop ODD first, and it gets worse over time. It's also predicted by high-intensity aggression to people and animals, destruction of property, deceitfulness, and problems with peers in preschool. There is some research looking at the origins of antisocial behavior. Starting with biological factors, twin studies do suggest a genetic component. And interestingly, we also see that genes seem to play a bigger role in childhood and adulthood than in adolescence. Likely because during those teen years, children are out of the house more and have more interaction with the environment. Looking at genes specifically, we see that genes associated with a difficult temperament and poor self-regulatory skills are also associated with antisocial behavior. However, heredity does have a larger effect on some types of aggression more than others. It tends to have more of an effect on proactive aggression than reactive, which we will talk about on the next slide. Antisocial behavior is also affected by social cognition because aggressive behaviors are often a reaction to how children interpret social situations. Aggressive children are predisposed to aggressive behavioral choices, which reinforces future aggressive behaviors. And two types of aggression from interpretation are reactive and proactive. Reactive aggression is emotionally driven antagonistic aggression sparked by one's perception that others' motives are hostile. For example, going back to Chapter 9 with the hostile attribution bias, if a child bumps another child's arm while drawing, it might be interpreted as being on purpose, and the child will react in a way as if that person was being hostile towards them. Proactive aggression is unemotional aggression aimed at fulfilling a need or desire, such as pushing someone to get ahead in line. And note that this is referring to a need or desire as opposed to a concrete object, as with instrumental aggression. Parents can also influence children's antisocial behavior. Through parental punitiveness, we see that harsh punishment such as spanking or yelling is associated with early problem behaviors, childhood aggression, and criminality in adolescence and adulthood. And this leads to a social cognition associated with aggression, such as assuming others have hostile intentions, having aggressive solutions to problems, and expecting aggression to result in a positive solution. In addition to this, we see that parents who use abusive punishment model aggressive behavior, and children subjected to abusive punishment tend to be anxious or angry, and are therefore unlikely to attend to what their parents are telling them to do, or to be motivated to do so. So it has the opposite effect. We also see a reciprocal relation between children's behavior and parents' punitive discipline, where when children are just reacting to being treated in this way, parents do it more. There is also the role of intermittent reinforcement, where when children are acting antisocial, their parents sometimes give in and reinforce this behavior. And like we talked about before, this really strengthens that behavior and makes it resistant to extinction. There is also the influence of poor parental monitoring on antisocial behavior. Monitoring children and knowing where they are and who they are with reduces the likelihood of associating with deviant antisocial peers. It also helps parents know if their children are hanging out with antisocial peers and to do something about it if they need to. This can be difficult, though, if monitoring starts late, because once children start engaging in antisocial behavior, monitoring can become a source of conflict. In support of this, the book does give a graph that shows that juvenile crime peaks between 3 and 7 p.m., when adolescents get out of school and are not being monitored before their parents get home from work. Instead, to give you an example about how bad this can get, this is a picture of a news article from my hometown where our local Taco Bell had to close down after school because it's been turned into a fight club. Parental conflict can also be a source of antisocial behavior. We see that children who experience verbal and physical aggression from parents tend to be more antisocial and aggressive than other children. Part of this might be because embattled parents model aggressive behavior. For example, we see that children whose mothers are being physically abused tend to believe that violence is acceptable and even normal. It might also be due to embattled parents tending to be less skilled and more hostile and controlling in their parenting. There is also influence from the family's socioeconomic status. We see that children from low SES families tend to be more antisocial and aggressive than those in a higher SES family. And this might be due to environmental stressors such as illness, domestic violence, single-parent households, or being an unplanned pregnancy, as well as low parental warmth from those stressors. In support of this, when families escape poverty, 4 to 7-year-old children tend to become less aggressive and antisocial. And when families fall into poverty or remain in poverty, children tend to increase in aggression and antisocial behavior. There are also peer influences on antisocial behavior. Aggressive children tend to socialize with other aggressive children and become more delinquent over time, sometimes to the point of joining gangs. And it's not just the direct peer group, but the larger surrounding group of peers or the culture of peers as well. Susceptibility to antisocial behavior tends to increase in elementary school, but it does peak around 8th to 9th grade before declining. There are epigenetic effects with antisocial behavior as well. For example, when children have the SLC6A4 gene we talked about earlier, or the DRD4 dopamine gene, or the MAOA metabolic enzyme gene, in addition to having adverse conditions such as high stress, poor parenting, or being low SES, children tend to be more aggressive than children with other gene variations. Lastly, it's important to talk about interventions for combating antisocial behavior. There is, of course, therapy and drug therapy, especially if the behavior is stemming from something like anxiety. There are interventions that target parents' behaviors and teach them how to reinforce or punish certain behaviors without punitiveness. There are school-based interventions such as Fast Track, which trains at-risk students to understand and communicate emotions and promotes positive prosocial behavior, self-control, and social problem solving with social emotional learning. And then there are community-based programs such as the YMCA or Girl or Boy Scouts, which we will talk about more on the next slide. Community-based interventions have really taken off in the last few years, and changes have been made to the current community programs to improve them. The first direction the book talks about is positive youth development, which focuses on strengths and assets compared to weaknesses and deficits. It really reinforces values of competence, confidence, connection, character, and caring. And this can really be added to something like scouting by just focusing on children's talents and what they like to do while teaching the wide variety of skills that they already do. And the second is service learning, which again integrates school-based instruction with community involvement. It promotes civic responsibility and positive behaviors such as empathy and self-awareness. And that is all I have for you this week. Don't forget to complete the quiz and assignment, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week.